Welcome back to BYoungMinistry.com, to another blog and to another podcast. Welcome to those who access the podcast through Rumble and YouTube. Let me remind you to click that like button, if you will, if you're watching or listening to the podcast. Click it so that we become visible to more people. And I appreciate you for doing that. Today we continue our study in the book of Romans. We're in chapter 1, verses 16 through 17, which reads, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith, from first to last. Just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." That's Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. We return to our study of Romans, where we are given the most life-transforming truths ever given to man in one book. In fact, every major doctrine in the Bible is delivered in this letter. If we really understand and respond to these truths, for us, time and eternity will totally be altered. There are 4 key words in these 2 verses that make up the thesis statement for this book. Once we have understood these 4 words, we will discover that we will never be ashamed of the gospel ourselves. These 4 words are power, salvation, believes, and righteousness. In verse 16 of today's passage, we read, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile." The Apostle Paul was not ashamed of the gospel because it deals with the bottom line real issue in all our lives. Paul had been imprisoned in Philippi, chased out of Thessalonica, smuggled out of Berea, laughed at in Athens, ridiculed as a fool in Corinth, stoned in Galatia, and yet he was eager to preach this gospel in Rome. He was convinced of its veracity. His eagerness was the result of understanding that the gospel does something no man can do for himself: to change his heart. It is the righteousness of Christ that makes the sinner worthy before God, and this righteousness is free to anyone willing enough to believe that the death, burial, and resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ solved our greatest problem. This is what Paul writes about throughout the book of Romans. Paul used the word power to describe the ability of the gospel to change the human heart. By using this word, from which we get our English word dynamite, Paul wrote of the omnipotence of God. The all-powerful God of the universe is behind this operative power of regenerating us, of making us alive to Him. And as a result, a change takes place. A change that's not overnight, it's not real fast, but the change is for His glory and for our good. There's a basic power within all of us which makes us clamor for change. Deep down within us all, we really want our lives to be different. But we are utterly impotent to change ourselves. The advertisers of this world know this and make billions of dollars on convincing us that their product will change our lives. But it never happens that way. This is why God delivered the gospel the way He did. He delivered the gospel of His Son as a force that He uses to transform our very lives through a personal relationship with Him. The Romans were a very proud people due to their advancements in the world. They prided themselves on their military power that could conquer all other nations. They also had a tremendous program of road building. They even had some of the greatest lawmakers of history. And Paul knew that the Romans also were powerless when it came to changing their hearts. They were powerless to eliminate slavery. In fact, up to half of the population of the Roman Empire were slaves. They were powerless to change the stubborn, hostile, hateful hearts of men and eliminate violence. The Roman Empire was full of violence and corruption, and the suicide rate was extremely high at that time. The Romans could do nothing about these things. It is the gospel of Jesus Christ only that unleashes the power of God to do these very things that man cannot do. In verse 17 of today's passage we read, "For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." The righteousness of God that Paul writes about speaks not of a righteous God judging an unrighteous world, as much as a righteous God imputing righteousness to an unrighteous world. I find it staggering that God would use his very own righteousness to forgive us. And the death of God was a must for the righteousness of God to be delivered to the ungodly. The salvation that God offers us operates only through faith. That's all. This salvation is not something we will ever earn. It is something we receive when we recognize our need for it. This is why the Apostle Paul spends the first 3 chapters of this book convincing us that we're sinful, wretched, and hopeless apart from Christ, before he delves deeply into the gospel. This is why the word law appears 78 times throughout this epistle. It is the law of God that condemns man in his sinful state. And it is only the efforts of Christ which render us acceptable before God. Biblical faith is trust. This faith, or the ability to believe, is a gift from God. And it is trusting and believing in our hearts that God raised the Lord Jesus from the dead. Faith in him renders salvation from the penalty, power, and presence of sin. It is not baptism. It is not moral reform. Salvation is not going to church. And it is not conforming to rules. It's not even self-discipline and restraint. It's not morality. No, this salvation is a personal relationship with God, wherein our hearts are being changed as we learn of his great love for us for eternity. My friends, I trust this blog and this podcast are helpful to you in your walk with the Lord. If I can be of further assistance to you, shoot me an email at BYoungMinistry@gmail.com. Hey, have a great day.